Well, wouldn't you believe it, we actually have some interesting news regarding the Riot MMO. And this time it came out of the demise of their opponents. So, a little bit of catching up on the Riot MMO situation. Over the last year, Riot stayed consistent confirming that the MMO has not been cancelled. And after Tryndamere confirmed that they are aiming for the release of 2030 at the latest, and this was after the MMO team kept hiring talented people, from previous engineers and leaders working on World of Warcraft, to passionate fans that successfully replicated an art style that Riot might be aiming for. And so long story short, stay assured, this game is still going. And from the current job listings, which, again, specifically state the MMO, Riot is still looking for technical artists, that means people who know how to do their shaders, and they are looking for 3D animators and environmental artists. And interestingly enough, this on its own might actually be a big deal. Because from these listings you can see that the team is mostly looking for art. Meaning there is a really good chance that when it comes to the gameplay design, the game is locked in. If anything, it is now gonna go down to iterations. But honestly, that's just a big tinfoil hat theory. In truth, it is possible they just have enough engineers. And so all they need is time to cook. Again, it is still 3.5 years till 2030. And yes, that is still a very dangerous journey considering the news we got last time. You see, the world of MMOs is kinda in a limbo. The true MMOs that actually do well are the old games that we already know. We're talking about World of Warcraft, RuneScape, Guild Wars, and so on. And it is extremely rare for a modern MMO to break out. And for the most part, and this is a very personal theory, I think it's because the modern MMOs mostly focus on the extraction kind of genre, where there is a multiplayer hub, then you get into an instanced world, you do something there, and you come back to the hub. And in 99% of all of these games, they kind of fail on delivering on the RPG feeling. If anything, they are closer to the friendslop genre. And that is all while people still care about traditional RPGs. You know, ones focusing on stats and numbers and RPG elements. Just look at Baldur's Gate, damn it! But again, that's just a very personal theory. And well, up to this point, there were 3 big games that actually tried to tackle this issue. The Ghost MMO, Ashes of Creation, and the Riot MMO. Of course, by now you would know that after some time of failing to build up hype behind the game, the publisher dropped the Ghost MMO and so it was cancelled. Of course, people would also know that Ashes of Creation burned down in its own separate spectacle. It got into an early access and it was, let's say, undercooked. After which, many of the devs behind the game started leaving. And that's because, as it turned out, most of the funding from Kickstarter was spent on private chefs and magic cards and other kinds of luxury, at least allegedly. More on that in a moment. And so, out of all the big dogs, only the Riot MMO remained. But then there were also some other unconfirmed rumors that internally Riot cancelled a bunch of other projects, which of course led into people believing that the Riot MMO was dead as well. That is, while the job listings kinda prove otherwise. But what if I told you that back in 2022, there was a totally different story being written? And it is only now that the rivals are gone that we get to talk about it. And thank God Riot didn't go with their initial plan, because in hindsight, we might have not been talking about this MMO at all. So, as I mentioned, Ashes of Creation went down in a glorious spectacle. Long story short, there were a lot of accusations, not only from the public, but also from the other devs working on Ashes of Creation, that the head of the studio pocketed a lot of money from the project. This would explain why, despite this being one of the biggest Kickstarters in history, the game was still quite undercooked. Of course, the head of the studio then didn't like these allegations, and lo and behold, a lawsuit is happening. And only a few days ago, the documents from this lawsuit became public. And what is that? Is that Riot Games in some of the emails? Well, this is something that scared a lot of people at first. But then people started digging into this and they started laughing. Because in a totally different universe, Riot could have actually saved this entire situation. It's just that Ashes of Creation kinda refused. This all actually started 4 days ago, where on the official subreddit we got an official message from Steven, the head of the studio. This massive post essentially claims that this entire situation was, and I quote, orchestrated public defamation campaign which was pre-planned by his opponents. And so that it was all schemed so that the entire company would end up in the hands of Rob Dawson. Now, just so you know, we are not actually diving into that in this video. This is all here just for context. It is an active lawsuit, and so eventually the court will say who's in the wrong. No, instead we are here because of Riot Games being in the emails. And so, back in 2022, which is also dubbed as the era of the COVID money, Riot gave Innerpit an offer that might have changed the entire outcome. And so, as was outlined in this email, hi Steven and John. Following up on our conversation last week, I'd like to share our initial thinking around the financial component and potential acquisition of Innerpit by Riot. It is clear we share a goal of creating and evolving a genre-defining MMO that delights millions of players for decades. With that goal in mind, we would aim to align our incentives, de-risking your investment in Ashes of Creation in the short term, while giving you meaningful upside in the long term. But most importantly, making sure the game has sufficient resources to achieve the vision and outcomes that we are collectively aiming for. So yes, Riot actually wanted to buy Innerpit Studios with Ashes of Creation to simply make MMOs better. Now, when it comes to the Riot MMO timeline specifically, this would be happening about 2 years before the big reset of the MMO. That one happened roughly around 2024. And so it is possible that in 2022 Riot didn't have a clear vision for their MMO yet, and so they wanted to acquire new talent to kickstart it. And since Ashes of Creation was also a very ambitious MMO, at least on paper, it made sense for Riot to look in that direction. Instead of the two being rivals, they could cooperate. And while the details are censored, I assume for company secret reasons, at the bottom we actually got some numbers. This represents a total investment of $250 to $500 million by Riot, which would further scale post-launch as we invest in additional AOC content and features over time. I look forward to discussing this on Thursday, and before then, we'll also send over initial answers to your operational questions. How project funding works, standard Riot benefits, what it means to be Rioter, and so on. In other words, yes, they would all become Riot. Now, the mark at the bottom is not actually Mark Merrill. It is Mark, the Chief Financial Officer at Riot Games. In other words, it's the guy who knows their numbers. But yes, in short, Riot tried to buy their entire studio for nearly $500 million. So then, why did that not happen? Well, funnily enough, both Mark Merrill and Steven talked about this situation completely separately. And because the alibi cross over perfectly, I think this is creditable. So Steven mentioned on Reddit, which was already on fire after everyone learned that it was all a big scam. I have the uttermost respect and admiration for the team at Riot and have a faith that they will create something great with their MMO. I hope the fans do too. At the time these discussions happened, I was advised by Rob, his rival, not to accept their offer and instead to counter them with ridiculous ask. When I did, the discussions did not move forward. Texts and emails will be brought up to light in further court filings as the case proceeds. In retrospect, it is clear that Rob and his associates saw the value of Innerpit and offered advice to torpedo their offer and proceed to use threats and concerns to force a takeover of Innerpit in their own personal gain. I am sorry that Riot was dragged into this public spectacle, and wish their team nothing but success and hope for an awesome game that continues to serve the players they so obviously care deeply about. Tell that to the people who complain about balance. Now here, as you saw, it was mentioned that in response, Innerpit came up with a ridiculous ask. We can only assume that they didn't want to sell the company and so they asked for a ridiculous number. And yes, it was so ridiculous, the offer did not go forward. And this is exactly what reflects in Mark Merrill's reply. Regarding the Ashes of Creation Riot rumor, shoutout to MMORPG, we looked at making an investment or even acquiring Etherpit a few years ago, but Riot decided not to move forward with the discussions. The team there shared our goal of making the next great MMO, something we are more committed to than ever, but combining efforts ultimately didn't make sense for us. And thank God it didn't. So yes, instead of buying a different studio, Riot decided to go forward in the very classic way. Just rebuild your own team from the ground. And yes, it took them about 2 years to do so. That was after the reset. But look at them now. Their project is currently the last one standing of the big ones. They managed to get crazy good people on their team. And they still have about $500 million in their own pocket. I would call that a victory. I mean, can you imagine their faces if Riot bought out Ashes of Creation and then they learned that not that much was actually done, and instead a lot of the money was spent on buying magic cards? I mean, I swear to God, if the Riot MMO comes out and it is undercooked, and if we see Riot's leadership running around with expensive Riftbound cards, I'm gonna be mad.